Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes? OK. So most probably you think I'm completely crazy. But before putting a name on that crazy guy, I am Patrick Allaert. These are my coordinates, so feel free to reach me anytime. I'm the author of a package extension, APM for PHP. It provides a native monitoring solution made in C. It's open source. And instead of log files, you can have all your errors, warning notices in a database with stack traces. It might be interesting. I'm also a PHP internals enthusiast, sometimes contributor. So if the last time you saw array to string conversion, I'm sorry, that was probably because of me. Because before array to string, that was possible. It just displayed array. It was completely stupid. I'm also a RFC voter. When, yeah, new feature, yeah, no, -1. So sometimes because of me, no. So when I started my first project that was online on the web, that was a lyrics website made in PHP 3. That was in, 98. Sorry, can you read this? I was using Microsoft ES and, no, can you read it on the back? Yes, still? Now can you read it? Perfect. Not talking about that anymore. I have the feeling that my first version of PHP code was not really well structured. And I think that when you hear PHP without frameworks, this is probably what you have in mind, because we all started there. And yeah, it was using Microsoft SQL Server. Yeah, so what's the big problem here is that I really feel like alone, and so what's wrong with you? You're not using a framework, so this is really bad. This is sometimes how I feel. And there are also, it's a little bit true, but I suggest you've heard about phptherightway.com. I suggest you to take a read at phptherongway.com. It's really interesting. The picture comes from there. Yeah, it's enlightening. So the first thing is to understand what is a framework. And apparently, I left a to-do. OK. The problem is that for a good definition of framework, you have almost as definition as frameworks. So this is really difficult to get one. So I can take some advertising to explain what a framework can do, and I really like them. I really enjoy. Framework is not absolutely necessary. It's just one of the tools that is available to help you develop better and faster. Like, you're not using it, guess what happens? A framework provides you with the certainty that you are developing an application that is in full compliance with the business rule, that is structured, and that is both maintainable and upgradable. Fantastic. More advertising. Guaranteed upgradability and maintenance. If you try to Google that word, you may find the framework I'm talking about. Or, this is the basic principle of a framework, not having to reinvent the wheel. I agree and disagree. I'm talking about that after. So, that was my shitty code. Connecting to the database, having queries, HTML, then treating the arrays, and yeah, things that was completely mixed. So I wanted to improve myself. I decided to use a framework. So most frameworks use an MVC-like pattern where you end up in a controllers, and in the controllers, you are doing stuff. So what I did is, now I'm using a controller, and I moved everything in the controller. That sounds really cool. Because I'm not using not using this old crappy code. Now I have something which is rock solid thanks to the framework. Upgradability guaranteed. Hell, yes. So one can say to framework or not to framework. And this is where I don't have probably the sound. Can I have the sound? No, you probably know the movie, and instantly. Perhaps we are asking the wrong questions. And that's it. You can think about a framework like not being what you are going to use upstream, what you are going to download, but like the end result. The framework might be your architecture, how you set up. You can adhere to coding standards, best practices, guidelines in your project. You may want to avoid reinventing the wheel, what we just mentioned before. But that's not the property of a framework. That's the property of a library, because a library is normally self-contained. You can use it, inject it in your project or not. So that's the true arguments of libraries. And you must reuse libraries. How are you going to handle request and response? What about the routing mechanism, templating, configuration, dependency injection? These are all parts that a framework handle, or the way you are going to construct your framework. If you can answer to these different topics, then you kind of master the framework you have. It might be a predefined one, but if you are not in control of all of these aspects, then you may have a problem in your project. So the coding standards, there's plenty of them. PSR, Symfony, Bear. Try to stick to those coding standards. Try to pick the one that makes sense for your project. I'm not saying you must, but there are plenty of suggestions. And to ensure everything is good in your project, try to use PHP code sniffer. It can find the problems, but it can also fix them. And don't hesitate to write your own sniffs to figure out that there is something wrong in your project. About libraries and components. Those are the part where you don't reinvent the wheel. And you can perfectly compose your project. And when I say compose, it's for a reason. You can use Composer to grab all dependencies and say, OK, I want that routing mechanism, that template engine, and let's start with that. You can also use Git submodel, Git subtree, especially if you are in control of all the dependencies. Git submodel is sometimes a little bit to handle. Git subtree, even more, but that one is really powerful. So if you are a little bit adventurous, you can try that one too. But Composer is really good. Remember, the best dependency you may have is the one you can avoid. And I'm coupling this with, it is best to reuse existing code than rewriting everything yourself. So combining those two things is really hard. It's hard because if you are having a dependency and you are not using it, it's kind of, it pollutes your project. If you're having dependencies and you just use 1% of feature of it, maybe it's interesting to consider another library that does the same thing, or maybe something exists in PHP directly to do what you want. For example, if you have a CLI script and you want just to write done at the end of your script, it's perfectly valid to write echo done. You don't need a console just for that. So it depends on what you are using. Too much dependencies can lead to conflicts. So this is why less dependencies is sometimes faster and easier to maintain. And the problem with dependencies is sometimes this. So here we have the weight of the sun, of a neutron star, of a black hole, and here, for example, node modules. Yes, it can be very, very, very heavy. So this is valid for nodes, but it's valid for any dependency management system, of course. So what about request and response? To handle them, you have plenty of PHP libraries. You also have a PSR 7, if I remember correctly, for the messaging. And you can, for example, select Symfony HTTP Foundation, send HTTP, Illuminate HTTP, React HTTP. Those are very good components. Today's frameworks have libraries that you can use without taking the whole framework. So they are loosely coupled, most of them. Another way is to leverage PHP directly. So for example, in PHP 4.1, those variables have been created. They are not global variables, they are super global variables. And they really don't behave like simple variables. Yes, they are accessible everywhere, but did you know they were lazy loaded? Who was aware of lazy loading with that kind of variables? So just a few hands. So it means that even if you are in Xdebug, you can see them directly. That's because of Xdebug internal way to work. But the variables, before you reach $_server or $_get or post and so on, those variables are not initialized until the very first moment you are going to use it. Many components don't take this into account and try to have a request object. And with all the dependencies of request objects and the use of $_get, post, and so on, you are not using the leading, you don't take benefits of the lazy loading mechanism. Also, this information in those superglobals comes from one of the CPI of PHP. You have many of them. The most common are Apache, PHP FPM, CLI, you have ISAPI as well for IIS. And it means that those CPI, it's server API. So it means that it depends, you have PHP and you have a server and you need to communicate with it. The way you are going to receive the headers, or you want to, send headers, the way you want to get the URL from something, this always depends on the CPU you have. So all those superglobals are already a kind of abstraction mechanism with an API layer which will abstract all the heavy work and where it comes from. It's already more than 16 years old available, and it didn't change much since that time. We also have other native PHP features. For example, printf, I'm not going through the list, but for example, a print in a CLI context is going to put something on the console. A print in a web context is going to send something to the server that is then going to be transformed in a TCP socket. So this is completely different. Sometimes I see some people trying to benchmark the speed of echo with some commas or echo with concatenation. The thing is that if you do this in a loop in a CLI script, you're not testing the same thing than in your web server because the underlying implementation has nothing to compare. So beware of benchmark like CLI versus other things. So all those functions can typically help you writing something to the browser or to your client without caring about what's behind. And this is really amazing. To my knowledge, it's the only language that provides so much feature to treat the input and the output in an HTTP context. In all the other languages, you need a library, you need a framework to handle that. For the routing, some PHP libraries exist as well, in Symfony, Zend, Laravel, and one I tried last week when discussing with Nikita. It was FastRoute. Until now, this is the fastest routing mechanism I've seen so far. It's not the most featureful, but it really does the job. It's really impressive in terms of performance. Note that Nikita is the one behind the performance of PHP 7. So it's really a smart guy. You may take a look at this library. But you can do your routing elsewhere than in PHP. Before, years ago, it was possible to reach the files directly. Like if you have a users.php file, you can put that in the URL and going to the file directly. So what we are used to do nowadays is to put everything into a common index.php or apt.php, just avoiding the assets. And it's like it's concentrating everything to one point. And the first thing you have to do is when you have concentrated everything in one point, you have to figure out, okay, what now I have to do with that? And so it looks like this sometimes, because you have all those requests, you have to handle them, you don't know where they come from, so you have to do some work. And instead of that, it's also possible to have not one entry point, but multiple entry points in your project, and still have good paths for SEO reasons, for example, or just to avoid the .php. So I'm using Apache. It works the same way with a little bit different syntax with Nginx, but it's about the same thing. You can, for example, rewrite different route to a specific file, and this file doesn't have to know what's the purpose of it, because you already did the routing at this level, so index.php will be for the main page, user.php for anything like / something, and this one to display a tweet. Yeah, this example is a 3-page sample applications I'm going to demonstrate after. There is a home page, there is a user page of a tweet, and one specific tweet. If you want to have some conditions about the rewriting, rewrite command is very powerful. You can even redirect something using the method used, like get, post, or delete, on the same URL to a different entry point. It makes you able to write controllers that are extremely specific so that you don't have to cover many different cases, which is also a kind of routing mechanism. If I want to take this approach, it means that I don't have one file, like a front controller, but multiple ones. Try to have those one and only those one available in a specific web or public or htdocs, whatever, directory, and not expose the rest of your application. An example of the index.php can be like this. I'm removing this. I'm going to explain this later, but what I do is trying to code, I want a user service, and I want to fetch the last users that joined the project, and then I want some rendering. Basically, it's kind of two lines of code, model and view. A more complex example, if I want to have content negotiation, then I also need a library or a tool that helps me knowing what the web browsers want or the client. Is this application JSON? Is this text HTML? Here I'm requiring another service that we are going to tell text HTML or application JSON, for example. Just an example. If you really want your controllers to be objects, that's possible too. Then what you need is in your web index.php, it's even smaller, but you are using this as a service, and in your service, you have your controller, which can use the __invoke function. There's plenty of ways to do that. Feel free to do what you are more comfortable with. That's an example of, it's just the same example that I had previously. It just encapsulates into an invoke statement here. And I'm passing the dependencies in the constructor, like controller as a service. The thing is, how can this work correctly without some kind of bootstrapping or command code before everything? There is a little known feature of PHP that still exists since, I think, PHP 3. You have AutoPrevent File and AutoAppend File. Those are files that are going to be executed before anything else, so even before the entry point you're going to reach. So to configure that in a php.ini specific to your project, or in a virtual host, Apache, htaccess, whatever, you use AutoPrevent File, and then you mention the file you want to, your Bootstrap file. Bootstrap file can look like this. What I really need to load the different class is autoloading. But you may want to have some PHP configuration, error handling mechanism, authentication, or whatever you want. For the templating, many libraries, I guess you are all familiar with Twig, maybe Zeta components template, Eden PHP template, or even Smarty. Of course, you can use PHP as a template language. That was a template language from the beginning. So there's different ways you can do that. You can require or include a file if you have some variables into your included files. The variables that comes from the upper context, upper scope, are going to be available in the next one. So if you're going to use that, try to have as few variable as possible, like, for example, from a specific function or a specific method. This way, only the variables from that scope are going to be shared when you include your PHP HTML files. You can also very easily create functions that helps you create your HTML, like page header, page footer, menu, and so on. It's very, very easy to do because it's just PHP, and you all know PHP, so there is really no magic doing that. Another way to create views that I prefer a little bit, especially for the context of the scope for variables, is using PHP class to handle to contain the HTML code wrapped into __ invoke. It means that my templates require some dependencies. These dependencies, for example, the title and a body, and I want the body to be a callable. So like a closure, a function that I'm going to call later on when I want to have the content of my page. This is the very topmost layout part. Everything behind don't have all the doc type, HTML, and so on. I discussed that yesterday with Rasmus, and I just figured out that at Etsy they are using PHP templates exactly like this. So they are doing the same. For configurations, oh, I think I missed something. No. For configurations, many libraries let you handle that configuration. Symfony, Zeta Components, Illuminate, the classic one. Packaged config, works config. That's a very interesting one if you want to discover it. You also have Pekel IAConf. So if you consider all of them, this is a Pekel, so it means it's an extension written in C. And it's going to load ini file when PHP starts the very first time. So not on every request, but much more like at the moment the server loads itself. So this way you have zero overhead in the process of a PHP ini file, an ini file, sorry. You can also leverage your server to provide some configurations, like, for example, in Apache. This is also what they recommend at 12-factor. Who knows the 12-factor app? Oh, not so popular. OK, this is really something you should investigate, whatever the language you are using. PHP lets you introduce environment variables with pass-env or a set-env. This way you can avoid configuration into your project directly. Or you can also use PHP native features like parse ini file. This is quite fast. It's the same logic that is used to parse the php.ini file. Parsing something like YAML files, if you don't have something that is written natively in C, it's always going to be a little bit difficult because PHP is not really a language designed for parsing. So this under the hood use something that is very efficient. Something that is a little bit more efficient than parsing an ini file is a big associative array with your config. I'm not really suggesting to work that way. I prefer the Apache way, but it's still very efficient in terms of performance because your upcache is going to save all the content, and it's not going to reload everything. Dependency injections, plenty of libraries like BitExpert Disco, the leak container, Symfony dependency injection, and a very simple one, which is Pimple, also from Sencio. It's very, very tiny, but there are also some ways to leverage PHP features. Native PHP features, like a hierarchy of PHP files that you require on one hand, and inside that file, you just do, at the end of the file, return, and you return something. This is something I really used a lot. First, it's extremely efficient because upcache is going to save that in a very efficient way. And I'm also manipulating PHP. I'm also writing PHP code. So I benefit from all PHP completion. I can type or disclose the return type. You can also have a list of global functions. So the first way would be, I want a user service. One way which is comparable to $container get user service would be to write require and then a PHP file. In my convention, I use DIC to denote that it's a dependency injection container requirement, but feel free to use your convention. So I require a file. If I open that file, what I see is that it only contains return and then some service. Because it's PHP, I can use that very way of requiring dependencies inside it itself. So for example, here, I am requiring a DB connection. That cursor annoys me. Same thing. What's inside DB connection? Here, I'm returning a new PD object, and all the configuration comes from the environment. This is something that goes really, really fast. And I cannot put that in a library, because there is no library. It's all PHP. So I cannot be famous because of that. It's a pity. You can also have a list of functions you create yourself. Like if you want the get user service, you write a global function get user service. That's going to return user service like this. Itself uses getDB connection, which is defined here, and which returns the new PDO, and so on. Kind of similar techniques. The advantage is in this one, if there is something that needs to be instantiated just once, and you may introduce a singleton pattern at that level, but I suggest you to not do so. That's I would say the biggest problem with most of the dependency injection container out there, is that they are doing, they keep a copy of the instance by default. So it means that when you are not using it, there's still an instance somewhere, so it's not going to be garbage collected. It's going to remain in your memory until a certain point. So I would suggest you, if you are using a technique like this one, to not use static variables unless maybe something that is really heavy to instantiate. But don't do premature optimization. A more complex DI example is this one. That's something which is in production since last year. And it was first we had a healthcare delivery gateway to provide. We returned this previously, and then we suffered some performance issue. So we decided to cache the result. Instead of modifying that class, we want to have separation of concerns. So we create a decorator class, which is caching, and that has another dependency. And the whole file is just returning something that still implements the same interface. So I didn't break any contract. So here I think I've been extremely fast today. So I can demo the application. The application I'm demonstrating here is available on GitHub under my account. It's named PHP sample application for PHP 7.1. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. So just want my browser back. So it's a demo, so normally it's supposed to fail somewhere. It does. So how about, okay, so that's my sample application, a Twitter-like application. No, I'm not a Star Wars fan, not at all. For example, I can see the tweets from Darth Vader, and I can click on one specific, clicking on the time, and that's another page. So those are the 3 pages of that sample PHP application. It's a simple one for the sake of demonstration. And I can try to benchmark this. I can start with 2,000 requests. No, that's slim. Let's test this one. OK, that was really fast. Well, I expected that. So I can try to put 20, let's do 20,000 requests. Still extremely fast. 200,000 requests. That's going to take a little bit more time. But I haven't implemented in this application any caching mechanism. It's just doing a pure SQL query. And I can usually achieve almost 30,000 requests per second. I haven't reinvented the wheel somehow, because I just reuse things that already exist in PHP directly. But sometimes your libraries are going to enrich some parts. So feel free to pick the elements that you're really familiar with and that where you are really using the features. But you can start a project by having something that is really stripped down, and you are enriching it with libraries as soon as you require the various features you're missing. So I can also benchmark Luke, made a before speed with me. So that one is a little bit more complex because in this page there is just more queries. So I'm not going to have the same kind of performance than for the very first page. So I lost a little bit, and I'm only having 20,000 requests per second. So if I want to debug the application, this is using PHP 7.2, so it's not really available yet. I'm going to replace my version of PHP with 7.1 because the problem is that I don't have Xdebug for PHP 7.2 yet. Too bad. Derek, I'm waiting for you. So now I put a breakpoint in the bootstrap.php file. And we are going to see the various steps when I debug an entry like this one. So I can use cur, hit sample. OK, it waits. So it means that I'm here. Autoloader. OK, let's see what's in Autoloader. I have a very standard PSR4 autoloading mechanism. I haven't used the one of Composer, but I propose to discuss this with me after why. Now that that was for performance reason, I tried to use something else. But now with PHP 7, the difference is less bigger than before. So it might not be necessary. So I define a spell autoload register. I want some error handlers, so I define the error handler and the exception handler. And now I directly enter index.php. Let's step in. Require DIC users. This is the first thing that's going to happen. So it opens the files. It returns me the object. But first, it's going to require the configuration. So if I press F7 again, I first hit the autoloader. And then I'm in my DB connection, which returns my PDO object. And now I am in the constructor of my user service, which is ready to call the getLastJoin, which was the function, the method I called here. DIC negotiated format. This is something I'm using negotiation negotiator. So I used Composer to include that dependency. It does content negotiation in a very, very, very efficient way. So I just ask him to return the value from negotiation, knowing that I would prefer first text HTML and then application JSON. And to pick between this one or this one, I'm just passing by the HTTP accept header that I received. The view. There are two view components here. The first one is the layout, which is the global wrapper, and with some titles. And the second one view is the listing of the various users. And I'm going to pass the last joint users, which I defined here. I'm going to reuse it here. So let's dig into that. First, register. So I'm in the constructor of the listing, which requires the user. Now in the constructor of the layout, which requires title, body, and the fact that it is the home page or not. This is a Boolean value. And now the cool thing with PHP as a template is that I can really use an Xdebug to also debug something into the template. I really loved Twig when I discovered it, but when I had some very, very difficult problems to debug that sometimes relies in PHP, I really had a lot of difficulties to debug step by step the generation output of Twig. So I came back to PHP template, and I gained some performance. The thing is that I can really breakpoint on any specific stuff inside the template. And now I'm mostly done. I have an exit point, and it's the only thing. So the only key I used here was F7. So I've been passed through every function calls. I didn't really, if I want to share something with another project, I cannot put anything in here in a library because they are all PHP features that I put together to have something that is really efficient. As soon as I want something which is, I can simply put things in a file for logging, but maybe I want to use the logger. So a logger like Monolog, for example. So what I'm trying to explain is that you should try to begin a project with as few dependencies as you can. Try to see what kind of features you can bring into it to save some time. And if you have something which becomes a little bit heavy or you don't use all of them, you can reduce the scope. and trying to get rid of some dependency. That's about it. I usually have a lot of questions on that one. So I will show this one. Okay, now I'm lost in my slides. So for the conclusions, first, try to not reinvent the wheel and try to get existing libraries when they really serve a purpose for you. Try to reuse concepts like using patterns. And I would like to say that PHP frameworks are not frameworks anymore. They are pre-glued, loosely coupled components that are meant to be either reused or to be replaced. So feel free to modify things in the framework you are already using. Less is more. So you can refactor your application by trying to target one component at a time to have something which is a little bit more lean. And I'd like to finish with two things. One quote of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, saying, "It seems that perfection is attained not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing more to remove." And last but not least, switch to PHP 7, please. Improve performance, use fewer servers, reduce carbon footprint, save the planet, and I'd like to have some children. So thank you very much. So now is the official time for trolling questions, and there is already one there. The microphone is on its way.
Working. I happen to like PHP for templates. The only missing feature that I would like to have auto included is auto escape to avoid cross-site scripting type of, so to define some type of function to clean the value by default unless said to do otherwise.
Yes, this is kind of missing feature. I completely agree with that. The first thing I do when I really use Twig is disabling everywhere auto escape. And the thing is that auto escape is not, it's really difficult to make it efficient because HTML entities or HTML special shards is a very heavy process, which is in big O(n) operation looping on over every files, every characters. If you have a special characters, it needs to be replaced with something else, but then it means memory reallocations because your strings becomes bigger. And if you are in Twig, for example, if you have a variable that you display 5 times and you have auto escape, so you are going to call just exactly this 5 times HTML entities on this one, not reusing the output of it. So it means that if you want to avoid doing over and over some escaping, you have to either disable auto-escaping to do it just once and reuse the output of the escape. And this becomes really ugly.
So you have to be careful.
I have to be careful, and I am extremely... I can very easily identify the spot where I have some display in my templates, because normally HTML, I never use them in a string. I just put HTML, and then when I'm going to use PHP and I want to echo something, I'll use the special lower than question mark equal, so that, okay, I'm in the context of echoing something. And this is showing me something so much then, okay, here it's like the dangerous part, this is where I'm going to escape, or sometimes not, just because I know it's, the variables from my class may be maybe integers, for example. I'm never going to escape integers, for example, like IDs. Very good question. Thanks. Another one. No, there is one over there.
So we can see that this approach is optimizing the response time very well. That's very obvious. But don't you think in a bigger project that have complicated business logic that will take time anyway, this optimization will become very negligible compared to what you can optimize from your current business code, like the business logic that you have? Yeah. So.
I understand. Here, my IOs are very fast. I'm using my local database. I have a SSD. So, of course, it makes things like extremely fast. Normally, in a web context, the biggest time of your request is supposed to be IO. So it's kind of normal then in a project you spend 95% of the time in I/O and not in something else. If you only have 5% of time in I/O and 95% of time in processing, maybe there is something a little bit wrong into the logic, I would say. If you have bigger and bigger projects and you have a lot of codes, then you are going to slow down that kind of performance. But it's often even more a performance impact with frameworks that tends to glue everything. You're going to have authentication, you're going to have this, and let's launch all the listeners for the events automatically, even if you're even not instantiating the event dispatcher. So this becomes really, really heavy the more code you have. So there as well you're going to have some performance degradation. Thanks. Other question? Okay, in the meantime, you can think about something. I implemented something which is extremely fast. Yesterday, I was in a Rob Allen's talk, which was really a splendid talk about Slim. So I had some difficulties to make it work without a htaccess file. I had some issue, but okay, sorry. Those are already very good components, really. Of course, if I'm going to benchmark them with a Xdebug session, it's not going to work, obviously. So let's tap Apache. I'm a bit confused in all my code. I think it's here. Okay. My configuration with Xdebug would prevent me another benchmark. But I benchmarked something as simple as just a little ping, which you are receiving a JSON with just a time in it. And I could not achieve more than 6,000 requests per second. And the only thing in terms of operation in that is just a time call. So this is why you may have a lot of overhead. And I would highly suggest to pick the components of Slim framework. But just because you really want them, and it's like cherry picking the different features. This is how I envision libraries. Otherwise, the best frameworks would probably be the one that just includes all libraries that composer can load. That's certainly the best framework. You have all the feature. You may not have the glue. Okay.
So, if I have several services depending on a database connection. So using require would open a new connection on each require, or reuse the connection that was previously opened.
Yeah, that's a feature I want to change. That if you are using require once on a file that returns you something, that you can potentially not reload the code, but get the same thing it returns. It's not going to happen because it causes more problems. So I'm not going to even suggest that in PHP internals. So what I usually do is creating myself static variables inside that function, so that I just set, if it's set, then I just return it, otherwise I'm going to instantiate it. So I'm talking about singleton. Singleton is bad, but all dependency injection containers are using it. So when is this bad? It's really bad inside your code. But in the dependency injection, which is on top of, and just want to put your dependencies into it, this is logic. So, but I prefer using the singleton pattern there, just when I know there is something that is already causing some performance issues.
So create a new instance for pretty much anything, except like resources, like connections to that you need, that you know that you will need several times in the call.
Yes. You sometimes you can also have, how to explain that? If you just have constructors, you don't have connections and things like that, creating objects are extremely cheap in PHP, especially in PHP 7, even faster sometimes than some kind of arrays, because arrays are really a very heavy structure. So even if you recreate a simple kind of object, normally it really doesn't matter. It's, in terms of memory, you may prefer being garbage collected just because you don't have an instance pointing to it.
Yeah, I understand that, just looking for the exception. So the exception are like connections and resources and connection to a database that will be used several times. That is expensive to open every time I need it.
Yes, depending on your I/O. So you may want to store them. Not that MySQL persistent connection, for example, are really cheap to create. Even if you do the new PDO things, is really cheap. Memcached, same thing. Other questions? Okay, so thank you for listening. I'd like you to suggest you to contribute to this little sample application. If you know a routing system, if you know a templating system that is worth having as an example, this project is not using just a master branch, but various different branches. So, for example, I'm about to add a twig branch so that you can compare master branch and twig branch to see how you incorporate twig in a project where you started without a full framework. And how are you going to introduce, and what files you have to change to introduce components by components. So I'd like to have something like a twig branch, a fast root branch, and so on and so on. So if I can have some help from people, I'd like to create some kind of benchmarks and also feature metrics by components as soon as you add them. Thank you very much.